Yeah.
All right. We are now live. So for the audience that does not know you, feel free to introduce yourself.
Perfect. My name is Melissa Fortunato. I am a retired FBI special agent. I spent 23 years in the FBI, and a good portion of my time in the FBI I spent as a hostage negotiator and for several years worked undercover. I now currently in my retirement am a trainer and consultant in the area of conflict resolution, de-escalation, and negotiation.
Okay, so I want to kind of just jump right into this. So one question I've always had, and I've always asked myself is, let's just say there's a guy that holds somebody hostage. My question is always, what's the point of that? Because
Mm,
ultimately, he's going to either die or he's going to get arrested,
yeah.
right? And because he's not going to get what he wants, chances are, or that rarely ever happens, and that's
Yeah.
usually in international situations. So, what's the point of holding somebody hostage if you're going to end up dead either by suicide or getting shot, or you're immediately going to get arrested on spot?
Well, what I love about your question is the core of part of what I do in my training and consulting is the fact that you even ask the question, what's the point? I think so many people actually don't think that all the way through. So, for your example, people in crisis, right? They're not always logically thinking and intentionally choosing behaviors, right? It's usually something that happens in their life. It's this big buildup to a crisis event, and they just react and obviously react poorly. So, I don't know in that exact example if there was a conscious choice to go to that place. But what is so important as hostage negotiators, and what I think is important for everybody to kind of learn to do in all parts of their life, is maybe asking that question, like, what am I hoping to accomplish in this interaction? So I don't know. That's what we do as negotiators. We would be asking, coming on scene, why did this happen? What happened right before this? And then what's all the stuff that built up to it to explain that behavior? Because you're right. Most times in a law enforcement negotiation, it's either going one way or you're getting arrested. I would think no one would choose either outcome, right? But I don't think they were consciously making choices walking to that place. But I think in any negotiation, difficult conversation that you have, if you think through that goal and you think through that process, you would obviously make better choices. Or if you're on the other side, asking yourself that question, I think can help you resolve a situation so much better to just kind of come to that understanding of why are we here?
Well, when I ask the question, it's usually because let's just take the scenario that somebody's holding someone hostage for $250,000,
Yeah.
right? Which is a very technical standpoint, right? And in a lot of cases, that's planned out. Are there cases where that kind of just happens? Yes. But let's just say the guy's like, I want $250,000 and a helicopter to for whatever reason, right? Or I want $250,000 and a private, flight to whatever country, like the Dominican Republic or Venezuela, where they don't have an extradition treaty. So again, when I ask what's the point, it's more of the perspective of they know that ultimately they should know at the very least that they're probably not going to get what they want, or that they just won't,
Yeah.
because the U.S. will, federal law enforcement will arrest them immediately on the spot once they get what they want. So my question then becomes, what's the point if they know that they're going to die or that they're going to get arrested?
So in those situations, like a kidnap for ransom, like you're saying, if it's planned and you're asking for a set thing, your demand is a set amount of money in return for the person. You're right. That is very different than a domestic violence situation where somebody is holding their significant other hostage and they're throwing out demands that maybe is money or a plane or an escape. We always ask ourselves when the demand comes in, what is that for? If it is money, and that happens a lot, many US citizens get kidnapped overseas. They call their families back and they ask for ransom money. To me, that is really a straight business interaction. Unfortunately, this is what people do for a living. In some countries, they found that that's their way to make money. The reality is sometimes ransom money is paid. It's not paid by the US government. We don't pay ransom, but there are families that pay that money. So those people have been rewarded by getting money. Maybe it's a ransomware negotiation against a major company or any company, really. and they lock up everything in their computer system. They ask for money. The people feel that they're in a difficult position and they pay to get their information back, or they pay to get their family member back. So in that situation, sometimes they do get what they want. Because if you're in a foreign country, we may or may not be able to track down who you are. Now, that's the chance they take, right? It's a risky business to have, because if you hold a US citizen, maybe our military goes in and does a rescue and something bad happens to you. So it's a risky business, but it does pay off occasionally, as opposed to a situation where maybe it's more of a domestic situation or a mental health break and you're holding people hostage and you're asking for these random crazy demands that are just never going to happen. But you have to evaluate the person, what the demand is, and try to understand what's behind it. And you only get through that through your negotiations and a series of questions to really understand what's behind it.
Well, it's funny that you're talking about this, because there's two situations I want to talk about. So more famously, there was a situation I'm sure you're familiar with, Brittany Griner, right? Where she was held by, I believe, the Russian government because she did commit a crime, right? So she did commit a crime in another country. So it wasn't a hostage situation, right? She was not being held hostage by criminals. It was international. There was a crime being committed by an American citizen on Russian soil. So then the U.S. government's response is to hand them back, in a very controversial move, one of the biggest arms dealers that they've almost ever arrested, the Merchant of Death. And everybody jokes about that. Everybody kind of sees that as a bad move. But why make that move? Why would you hand over, when there's soldiers, that are being held as well by the Russian government or by other countries? Why hand over one of the most dangerous criminals you have over for someone that got arrested on a marijuana charge in another country?
Yeah, these are complicated analysis that they have to do, right? And sometimes maybe somebody like a Brittany Griner, you are put in a position, maybe through some choices that you made, or the country that you were in, or the point that we are in our relations with that country. And I imagine they either felt that she violated their law and they were just following their normal legal process, or they were recognized an opportunity to make a point, right? And so I was not involved in any of that negotiation exchange, full disclosure. So I don't know all of the details. I don't know all the details of the exchange for the Russian arms dealer that they turned over. I don't know where he was at fully in his sentence. How much longer had they held him? Was he going to be released soon? Some of those things I think would go into the decision. I'm sure they have considered all the other people that are being held at that time, because there's that Paul Whelan is another person that's been held for a period of time and has not been part of a prisoner exchange at this point. I'm sure there are tons of conversations back and forth about that. And, it still is an American citizen that I'm sure we were hoping to get back. And so you have to weigh all of those things. Sometimes it's not always an equal exchange. But there's things in the long term. It may seem in this immediate interaction that it seemed out of balance, but I don't know. I mean, sometimes you weigh those things that it appears out of balance. Maybe in the future, you can use that as leverage. Maybe in the past, this is something that's come up where you got more leverage the last time, and maybe there was a decision to play that out. Like I said, I'm not privy to all the details of how they went through all of that. But I think those are so many things that go into that decision. I just know from being involved in some government negotiations at a much lower level, that is the calculus that we all go through every time, to just ask so many questions and weigh the positives and the negatives.
Well, and this is a follow-up to that. So, with regards to the fact that, and by the way, this isn't going to be mainly about politics. This is just like a general.
It's okay. I love both.
Yeah, just general questions about negotiation. So, very recently, there has been multiple wars that have happened around the world: Russia and Ukraine, and then there's the other, Israel and Palestine, and then now Iran too. But let's just keep it at the simples of Russia, Ukraine, and Iran. What?
It's very complicated.
Yes, and Palestine versus Israel. So many people on both sides of the political sphere think that there should be in both wars some type of a peace, right? Some type of a ceasefire or a peace treaty. What becomes problematic there is how do you negotiate that when there's two countries with such heavy bad blood between them,
Yeah.
right? Because Russia has made attempts to assassinate Zelensky, for example. And then at the same time, there's been drones, I believe, in Moscow that have presumably tried to do the same thing. Was it Zelensky? Was it Putin? I don't know. I'm not going to put that out there. But we have that. Then on the other hand, you have Israel and Palestine, which, I've was just speaking to somebody about this, where on one side you have, on both sides you have people that do not like each other to such an extreme that no matter what they do is justified,
Yeah.
which is problematic no matter who that is. So in both circumstances, how do you negotiate between these four people, these two groups that have the most utmost hatred for each other to such an extreme, to the point where no matter what any of these groups do to each other, they are totally justified and they're basically not human to one another.
Yeah. It is so complicated. I mean, that's a huge a discussion, and I'm sure me sitting here is not solving the whole thing. But some points to that are, a lot of it is, you're right, the history of the interaction between either two people or two groups, right? That plays into all of that. And you probably have years of aggression and violence, and then a response and a reaction to that. I think if you're truly going to be a negotiator to try to negotiate peace between these groups, I mean, wow, is that a major undertaking? And it wouldn't help to always have a third party be part of that negotiations, right? Because it is probably difficult for those two sides to come together. And you may need a third party. The thing that makes negotiations so complicated, though, is you have to have those two parties agree to what is laid out. And sometimes you could have bad actors. Sometimes you could have people have misunderstandings and miscommunications about what a certain behavior is that causes them to react a certain way. Like, it's really delicate because the trust is completely eroded between both sides in any of those: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Iran, all of it. And so you have to work through that level of trust and communication. And does that take forever? And it takes good intentions on both sides. Sometimes people probably realize from the violence and the war and the killings, the cost of this bad communication, this bad interaction. But I think we learn over the history of people, right? People forget and time goes on. And then, if you're not consciously making the right decisions of your interaction with that person, boy, it can disintegrate quickly. And you probably see this in your life and my life. And now we see it on the global stage, right? It's still all human beings. And this interaction it comes down to some of the most basic human elements and communication. And that's what I think, if people get, any takeaway from just their own lives, is having that level of communication, right? It really comes down to modeling that behavior. Like, you have to treat people a certain way in order to get that back, right? And it shows up at, like I said, these big global levels, or just in every human interaction that we have. And I think that's what people miss sometimes, is that modeling of the proper behavior, because we're all busy or stressed or mad, and we react out of that instead of trying to think long term about where we ultimately want this to go and how we want to have this interaction be, or how we want this relationship to be.
Well, one thing that when you mentioned a third party is that people always point to the United States as and this happens all the time, and this is partly why America is, when Americans get kidnapped, for example, right? The United States is very on top of that most of the time, at the very least. Are there cases where there's been mismanagement? Yes, but generally they're very on top of it. When an American gets arrested, it's this very, very big song and dance about, we got to get this guy back, and it's all over the news and everybody's talking about it, right? I think this even happened with a kid about my age in North Korea. That was a
Yeah.
U.S. citizen who went there,
Yeah.
and he came back and he was basically dead. But the United States is very well known to intervene in situations, and it kind of is seen as the world police. So when it comes to these countries like Israel and Palestine, of which we are allies with Israel, um, and with Russia and Ukraine, I don't know if we're allies with Ukraine, but we have given tremendous help to them. So the question then becomes, how do you negotiate between, as the United States, what's the United States' role? Should they step in and say, we need you to do this and that, or like how do you manage
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that play to that, right? Because we are our own country with our own interactions with each of these countries. And so there is a national security interest for us to shut certain things down, to support and build up other things, right? And there's a lot of conversations about understanding our position. I don't know that I could say the US is trying to be the world police. I don't know that we would want to be the world police per se. But we do have a play, and people feel a certain way about the US, good or bad. But we get pulled into a lot of these interactions. I understand why we support certain things, because I think there's an interest for us not only to support that country, but for ourselves in the US, which I'm sure is what is some of the decision making by our government officials on that. And there's a benefit to that. I think you'd have to do that cost benefit analysis there to decide when to interact, when to not. Maybe we interact just with money, but maybe we step in, because I think some of the examples you gave was us advocating on behalf of our own citizens. But our involvement in Israel and Palestine, or Ukraine and Russia, is probably more of a national security interest. We could have American citizens living there also, but I think ultimately that decision is made because of the interest and how does that benefit us, whether it's support of our allies or on a global stage, because maybe we perceive one side to be a little bit more of an enemy, and we're trying to shut that enemy country down from getting bigger or more power. Because there's so much on the Russia, Ukraine, and NATO and all of that, and how that builds. So I'm sure they consider all of that in the discussion. It's fascinating, if you have a love of negotiations, which I do, is to see this play out on the world stage, because you can see some of these core negotiation issues showing up in such this large scale conflict.
Well, the reason I call the United States the world police is because they are generally known to intervene in situations, right? It's kind of a facetious term, but it does serve a lot of accuracy. But when it comes to, I forgot what I was going to ask. It was a good question. It's fine.
You're like, it'll come back to me. Yeah, I will say I understand what you mean when you say you call us that, because I do think some people see us that way. I think sometimes we get labeled a certain way. I do think the US probably sees themselves as this democracy that we are trying to have other people in the world replicate. And so sometimes we either put ourselves out there or we are drawn in for that reason. So I did understand what you meant by the point.
Yeah, well, actually, I do remember the question, funnily enough. And it leads into something that what we were just talking about. So I've had multiple CIA and FBI people on, and one NSA person who I actually didn't know was in the NSA until he came on and he told me that he was. But there is one topic that I somewhat come back to, which is terrorism. So I've had this dialogue with multiple people, and it's something that Sarah Adams, who was the head of the Benghazi investigations, originally said that I like to ask people. And it's something people generally agree with, which is when it comes to terrorists, right, in the Middle East, for example. And I want to give a little bit of context. I asked her about the clip of Donald Trump where Sean Hannity is interviewing him and saying, hey, you had a call with the leader of the Taliban. What was that about? Did you see this clip?
No.
Well, basically, Sean Hannity's like, what was that about? And Trump, in response, he's like, "Yeah, Abdul, I did. I don't know if that's his name, or if I think it might have been the head negotiator he was on the phone with, but he's like, yes, yes, I was on the phone with him, and I said to him, like, if you kill one more soldier, here's a picture of your house, basically, right?" And then he texted him a picture of his house, and then the Taliban's response was, "Why do you send me a picture of my house?" And he's like, "I don't know. You're gonna have to figure out that one for yourself." And everyone kind of touts that clip, especially Trump supporters, as being this really like awesome moment. Now, when I asked Sarah about that clip, her response was, "You shouldn't have that type of dialogue with terrorists because terrorists like to be talked to like they're powerful and like they have some type of leverage over you. So when you threaten them, they know that they have something over you.
Mm.
So therefore, they feel emboldened because they feel like their power has continued, and they are really just bullies, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? Well,
Yeah.
so when it comes to people that you cannot have a dialogue with and you cannot negotiate with, one of those people are often touted as terrorists. Do you agree with that?
I agree more with Sarah. I don't know that exact quote or her well, but with her position, as you're stating it to me, I do agree more from her angle. I don't know if that interaction that Trump said, I don't know that quote, but if that's true, if that's even true that that interaction happened, um, if it did, I would agree that that would not be a position I would ever take as a way to communicate, especially as like the leader of the free world. Do I recognize that sometimes there is a power play to state your strong position and the ability that you have, right? When I would do hostage or any negotiations, not necessarily hostage, but even like a barricaded subject, it was with somebody, they're shooting at the police when they go to arrest, a SWAT team comes. I don't need to get on the phone and say, look at all these guys behind me, right? We could shoot up your house and kill you in 5 minutes. Would you like to talk to me? Like, that's not the approach, right? I think jamming power down someone's throat, what it accomplishes, much like Sarah realized, is you put people in a competitive positioning. And that's not where we want them to be. If we are trying to resolve something, you need to put people in a more relaxed position so they are willing to work with you. I think you could work with anybody. I think you can negotiate with anybody. I don't think because you're a terrorist, that means we can never come to some resolution. So for that reason, I'm always coming from a place of I'm wanting you to feel that we can work together, because that is like a threat by me showing you the house and then also trying to be coy. Maybe it sounds really cool in a clip to say it. It does. And I think in our country, we love to like sound cool and be tough and brash. I don't know that's always successful in negotiations. I think it feels super cool in the moment, and you may feel great saying it, but I don't know if it puts you in any position to move towards a successful resolution. So I would never, as a negotiator, say that. And I didn't say that when I had an entire SWAT team behind me. It's obvious, and you can play your power positions, but I think you need to be very subtle in the way that you play them. You need to be very strategic in how you say it. I don't think it's always bad to show your hand a little bit when you have that power play. You just have to really be strategic in how you do it.
Yeah. Well, Sarah also mentioned that it's funny because the guy's house that he sent a picture of, it wasn't even in a country that we were at war with. So it's like what could we even do about it? I think it was in a country that I think it was Pakistan, I want to say. Something like that. But it's a country we're not at war with, so it was kind of an empty threat at the end of the day anyways. But there's another famous clip where he actually does something similar with which also went viral. And was also seen as like a cool thing with Kim Jong-un,
Mm.
where Kim Jong-un calls Trump and says, "Hi, I have a big red button on my desk, and you know all this." Like he's just basically playing with him. He's like, "I have a big red button on my desk, and I push it whenever I want." And then Trump's response was, "Well, so do I, and mine's bigger, and mine actually works."
Yeah. Well, okay. Would I also say it like that? No, but I understand sometimes when people are confronting you in a certain way, you have to call them out on what's coming, like how that was perceived on your end. And so I think there's maybe a more diplomatic way that I would say the same thing that Trump said, right? I think Trump and I probably communicate very differently. um, And I get that if someone's saying that to you, sometimes you have to present to them the facts that are also true, which is, yes, the US does also have nuclear weapons. We also have a lot of them. We have tested them. And maybe we have bigger and better ones. But you have to watch how you say that. And so I kind of understand the logic behind that. And I don't disagree that you have to present that in a negotiation. But again, I don't know if this is a sound clip for television to sound really cool and tough, and I don't take stuff from anybody. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much in the persona of Trump, that of what he wants to portray to the world. And so maybe he did say it. I don't know that specifically, but I think in like a serious negotiation with another country that maybe has a volatile world leader, I would try to lead the conversation differently and lead him in a different path, because I think Kim Jong-un comes from a position of wanting to be dominant, but I think it comes out of a lot of fear and not maybe being this power country. And so you have to watch how you do that when you actually are a country that has that power, and whether it's nuclear or even just on the world stage.
Right. Yes. Kim Jong-un is a very, very, very big fish in a very, very small pond. Or he's a very small fish in a very big pond, depending on how you look at it. So
which way you look at it? Yeah, you're right, because you could look at both. Yeah.
Yes, because from the world perspective, very small fish,
Small.
right? He's just another dictator. As much as the media would like to say he's a super powerful person, he's really not. Although he does have allyship with China, but that's, neither here nor there. But generally,
that is an important position to realize. Who is he allying himself with? Who is trying to use him also to be part of their coalition? Like, that's why, like, every step in this national security negotiations, all that is so delicate, because you have to do that analysis all the time of like understanding, who is this person? Why are they acting this way? What does it mean? Who are they connected to? And how does that play out for us? Right. So it's really delicate.
Well, when it comes to now pushing a little bit away from national security, but it's a very conceptual question. It's, what is the key in a negotiation? And my theory is basically trying to relax the person and basically buttering somebody up in a way, sort of, to negotiate with them, to talk with them, to relax them, put in a position where they're not terrified. That's more in a hostage negotiation, but what is the key in a negotiation?
I think you definitely hit on something. Is you have to put the other person in a position where they feel comfortable and that you are coming from a good place, right? So I'll challenge you on your wording to like butter somebody up. You have to believe it, right? Because one of the main things in a negotiation is your mindset, and how you feel about a person, how you feel in the interaction shows up in that interaction, right? So whether this is true in your personal life, you're going to buy a car, any negotiation that you have to like understand how you feel walking in and how you are to this other person. And so if it matters, and I would argue almost every human interaction matters in the long run, you should be conscious of those thoughts. So any negotiation I had, I've done negotiations that involved the Taliban, that involved a drug gang that had kidnapped a competitor's mother and wanted money. And then I've negotiated, a barricaded subject that just didn't want to be arrested, right? I had to be very conscious of what my thought process was in that moment, because it shows up in my words, it shows up in my actions. And I want the other person to not only feel it, hear it in my words, that I'm actually there to really resolve something. Because in those situations, in my negotiations, it does matter, right? But even in my interactions with my children and my husband, it matters too. So I don't ever want them to feel like I'm trying to win at all costs and I'm trying to have you lose. Because if I win, yay me, right? You can't win in every interaction. You can't dominate in every interaction. If that's your goal, you've missed the mark. And so if I'm having an argument with my husband and he says something and my mind goes to, oh my God, I have the best response back, I can stick it to you and prove that you're wrong and I'm right and I'm going to feel great. I've lost track of this argument. I've lost track of what the point of the argument is, right? But if I come from a place of, I love you, we're a family, I want you to feel good in this relationship, then maybe I present my awesome counter argument back in a different way that doesn't leave you feeling bad, right? Because that's not my goal, is to leave you feeling bad. And so I just think understanding mindset, a lot of people I've negotiated universally would be regarded as people that we could all say we don't like. So I could be righteous in treating them a certain way and have people behind me going, yeah, that makes sense. We all hate them. But that doesn't get me anywhere, right? So if I have a goal and I want to accomplish it, that's, I think, one of the biggest things. So I think that is what you said going in, is that you're right. It is a lot about how you make the other person feel.
Well, I think it was Chris Voss. He said that the key is really empathy.
Yes.
And it's trying to basically put yourself in their perspective and say, if I was in this perspective, how would I want to be talked to, or how would I need to be talked to, is the more important one.
Both.
Because want to and need to is,
or both. Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes people aren't aware of what their needs are. And if you are sophisticated enough to hear something, to see poor behavior, but really get behind it and understand what that is, and you can address that need, you're deadly. But I agree with Chris that it is all empathy, right? That is part of that process of the way a negotiator's mind works. And I think for anybody, the more time that you spend on trying to understand the other side, whether it's being intentional, whether it's being empathetic, that maybe for some people feels touchy-feely, it's also strategic, right? If you really understand what's going on, you have so many more options to accomplish a goal. My hope would be that you would be collaborating with the other person, understanding what they want, and working together as a team to try to make sure everybody leaves with, feeling better about this interaction. Because I think, like you said, people have needs they don't even realize. We see that a ton in crisis negotiations, right? Because people really are acting out, and sometimes there's something behind that. But in any interaction, as long as you're willing to see the other side, people get triggered, people shut down on you when they think you aren't willing to see their side. Because why would I want to see your side if you won't even look at mine? I actually was just listening to a friend of mine who is like a wonderful trainer, so smart in this negotiation space. And he says something that I also say, he just said it better than I did. But he says, if you want to be a persuasive person, you have to show that you can be persuaded. Right. So I also say this, like, if I'm going to ask you a question and I really want to understand behind it, I have to be willing to change my position based on the information that you give me. Otherwise, what's the point of the question? Because if I'm not going to factor it in at all on what I'm thinking, then there's no point, right? I'm just going to continue arguing my message. And so I think people that are better negotiators have that ability to take in the other person's side and consider it and have it maybe change your position.
Well, when you say you have to show that you be persuaded as well, so what dialogue exactly occurs? So let's just say you have stereotypical hostage situation of guy gets in a fight with his wife and pulls out a gun and then decides to hold her and her kids hostage, right? Or even just her.
Yep.
How do you, and then he calls 911 and says, I have my wife and kids, or just my wife held hostage. I need cops over here now, whatever, bring in the negotiator, like whatever. He's making these demands. What is the dialogue? Do you have a script, like, or a general idea of what to say and how to go about it? Where do you start even with someone like that?
Yeah. So there is not a set script per se, right? Because every interaction is different. Every person is different. And so I wish in my trainings, I could tell you, if you said these 5 things, you will have a successful negotiation, right? I could make millions if I had that. But what you did was so smart, where you say, okay, here's the situation. I have a guy that took his wife hostage, right? Now, just to argue back and forth, where he probably is not the one calling the police and saying, I need you over here. A lot of times what would happen in this situation is either she called or somebody heard the interaction, and then the police arrive and then he is being held in much more of a defensive stance, right? But this is what we do as negotiators, is you analyze all that stuff that you said. Okay, I want to know, what's the relationship between the two? How did it come that the police were called? Because if you do have a guy that's holding his wife hostage and then he calls the police, that tells you something different than the neighbors saw the interaction and now we're coming to his home where he's holding his wife hostage. That's different. And so it's each little small bit of information and intelligence that you can gather from a situation will give you more of your assessment and help your strategy on how you're going to decide to communicate with that person, right? Like that's two things. If I'm ever going to teach anybody to be a hostage negotiator, those are the two things, right? Your assessment and your communication plan. You have to take that whole assessment together, and each of those little data points put together a picture that help you figure out what are the questions that I'm going to ask and how am I going to interact with this person. Good negotiators ask a ton of questions and they don't make a lot of assumptions, or if they have assumptions in their head, they are conscious of it, challenge themselves, and ask clarifying questions to see if the stereotype, the assumption, the profile they come up with is correct. All of that interaction that you have, we call it active listening skills, right? And there's these 8 skills that the FBI trains their negotiators for how that we communicate, listen, and talk. And all of that shows that you're really listening and have a genuine interest in the other person. It's displaying that empathy that we talk about. When you display that empathy to another person, you really create this rapport with them. And as you work along this, as you build that rapport, that's when you can start to have influence over somebody. And that influence is when you can change behavior. I can't listen to you and not display empathy and think that I'm going to get you to change your behavior at all. I only get that from us making that interaction and that connection, that rapport building, because that's when people are more willing to listen to you. I'm sure you've seen that in your own life, right? Like if you had a problem in your life and something you were worried about, are you going to go to a random stranger you don't know at all and ask their opinion? Or are you going to go to someone that you actually really care about, that you think has your best interests and really listens to you? And so that's sort of the script that we have. Is like the FBI has this thing called a behavioral change stairway. And it all starts with active listening, displaying empathy, and you work your way up the stairway of rapport to influence to behavioral change, right? That's how we see all interactions. So in terms of a script, that's what we follow. But there is no set thing to say, because when I ask you a question, George, I don't know what your answer is going to be. So I have to be adaptable and flexible to know when you say a certain thing, I have to put that in my mind. I have to put that into my assessment of you, my profile of you, see where it fits, and then decide what the next question is. And then ultimately, when I'm learning more and I feel like I have displayed to you that we're listening, I've built empathy and rapport with you, then from there, I can maybe make some suggestions. I can make some offerings to maybe solve this immediate problem, or to present things to you that you help make decisions that lead us out of this hostage negotiation, maybe. But that only comes after you've done the work of listening and building empathy with a person. So many people come in and just try to problem solve right away. And it doesn't land as well if you don't spend the time in the beginning to develop that connection and that rapport.
So now I would ask you, when you're trying to learn something from someone, which is very important, when you're trying to get certain information from somebody in a hostage situation, whether that be a ransom or they're trying to hold their wife hostage for whatever reason, for whatever they want, how do you go about learning something from someone else during a negotiation?
And then when you say someone else, do you mean like a third party, not the hostage taker?
No, I do mean the hostage taker.
Okay.
Like just in the negotiation, hostage taker or takers, how do you learn or gain information from them that they might be otherwise reluctant to give in some cases?
Yeah. So sometimes it is just a series of open-ended questions, right? We try not to ask yes, no questions, because it only gives you one answer and it's very short, right? I want to ask you the who, what, where, when, why questions to understand the whole story and the whole picture. You're right. Initially, some people may be resistant and hesitant to answer some of these questions. So in a hostage negotiation, we are pursuing multiple tracks at the same time, right? So I'm talking to you, I'm talking to everyone involved in this side, I'm trying to gather intelligence on all fronts, right? If it's a domestic situation, I'd be trying to have comms with you. It tells me something if you'll talk to me. It tells me something if you won't talk to me and are avoiding me. It tells me something if you put the victim on the phone. I take all of that to develop my profile. I probably would go talk to your mother, your neighbor, your employer, and I learn more and more bits of information from you. And so that's what makes a good negotiator is we ask questions of everybody, everywhere, and try to learn as much as we can. So in any negotiations, all that preparation, it's all that data points and fact finding that you try to have to put together to understand this puzzle that you're looking at. And if I don't know what a certain behavior means, I really try to ask. Like, so what's going on? I see this happen. What were you trying to say with that interaction or, that activity? Sometimes you don't know and you have to ask the question. But that's how we just get it from open-ended questions and taking all that information in and holding each bit of intelligence and putting it together. We work together as a team also. So it's not just me, Melissa, showing up and resolving this whole heavy duty situation by myself, right? We have people that are just writing down the facts that they're coming in. We have people that are creating a timeline of everything that happens. We have a SWAT team and snipers that are watching from different positions, right? I have a coach that sits with me and said, Melissa, you're talking to George, but you missed this one key point that he said, or you're missing that his tone is not matching what he's saying, right? In some hostage negotiations the FBI has done, the hostage taker is saying one thing to them, but yet the SWAT team has a camera or something that they've seen that shows that person is reacting very differently inside the crisis site than what they're saying. You have to be able to put that all together to try to figure out or challenge what's going on to come to a successful resolution. So it really does get complicated, all the different parts.
So now moving on from, actually, let me ask you this, two things. Number one, first of all, what's the most important thing that you've learned when it comes to hostage negotiation?
I think I said this before, is like I am surprised at how much your mindset makes a difference in any interaction with people. And that just being conscious of that and slightly adjusting it can make a huge impact on your interaction with people. And the other thing is that assessment process that I just do very naturally. I feel like being in the FBI, working undercover and working as a negotiator, it's like trained my brain and my response over the years that it's just an automatic the way I do it now. But every interaction of something that happens, I'm always wondering, like, I wonder what that meant. And I wonder how, like, what's going on with that other person that's having them show up in this interaction this way. And I'm amazed at, like, just listening to the way people talk. What do they talk about? Tells you what they value, what they're interested in, the words that they use. If you can absorb the words that they use, understand what's behind it, and then communicate with them that way, you are much more persuasive in your argument. I give the example of my husband. He is a 100% Italian, U.S. Marine, FBI agent. So he was a Marine infantry officer. That's a very defined personality, FBI agent. One time he's having just a silly back and forth with my daughter over some softball practice issue. And they're going back and forth. And I said to him, oh my gosh, Jeff, like, just relax. Or no, I said, just surrender, right? His reaction to me was like, I'll never surrender. No, because knowing his background, surrender was the worst word that you use with an infantry Marine officer, FBI agent, right? If you told me to surrender, the things I think about, the things that are important to me, the way I talk, I'd be like, you're right, I should just surrender. Because to me, that means something different than it does to a military person, right? And so just understanding the impact of even certain words, if you choose different ones because your assessment tells you to talk to people in a certain way, I think it lands so much better because they can hear it better if it's in the words or the style that they're more comfortable.
Well, what's it called? What's the most important thing you've learned in your career, though? Just in general, everything that you've done.
Yeah. I would say it is all connection with people, right? Whether I was doing an interrogation as with a target of, my investigation that I was arresting, whether it was a negotiation, whether it was an undercover and me trying to ingratiate myself to someone, it's making that connection with that person has you be so much more successful. I know people always think like you have to be competitive and tough, and I think sometimes those work in the short term. I'm not saying competition doesn't work at times. I just don't know in the long run if it does work. And so my most success has come from me really like making a connection, understanding what do we have in common and highlighting it and presenting it and putting myself in a position with that person where it's not me against you, right? It's you and I together against this problem and getting it solved. So even a defendant that I had arrested, I had a new agent that was with me and she was training. And I remember I was going to court and the subject of my investigation, who was going to court that day to plead guilty, says, "Hey, Melissa." And the new agent says to me, "Oh my God, you let him call you Melissa? Like not Agent Fortunato?" And I was like, "Of course. Like it's my name. I don't need to come in with a power position of I'm Agent Fortunato and you treat me a certain way." Especially if he's being friendly and pleading guilty and all those things. Now, if he was a defendant that was difficult and challenging, I may change my tone and make him, only have him call me Agent Fortunato. But it's all of those things if you use them. I think it creates this relationship and interaction with people. So you just have to be strategic in what you're trying to do.
So, do you have any regrets at all with your career?
Oh, I really don't. I tried so hard to I kind of always push myself out of my comfort zone. That has paid off in the long run for me. I am a naturally worry person. I think about everything. I get anxious about, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if it's too hard. I'm not comfortable. I have learned over time that if I just sort of say yes to the next step, that has taken me great places. If I had thought 5 steps ahead, I may have said no because it seemed too overwhelming. Right. And so each time I kind of take a step and then I'm like, oh, shoot, now I got myself in this situation that maybe makes me nervous. But I just want to take, the next step and see where it goes. That has gotten me in situations that I never thought I would be in, whether it was undercover negotiations or just as an agent. And so I really don't have any regrets because I tried to very consciously choose things as I went along. I had the best run. I had a great career. It was so fun. The FBI was the best thing for me in my life. All of those things changed me into the person I am now. So no, I have no regrets. Mm-mm.
Now, this is more going into specific events and even events with the FBI itself, both with your career and other people's career. So, number one, I had Matthew Cox on my show. Who do you know who Matthew Cox is?
I do not offhand, but can
He
you give me a little more light?
Yeah, well, he stole $55 million total in mortgage fraud, right? He
Okay.
was the former most wanted fugitive of both the FBI and the Secret Service. And he was on the run for like 20 plus
Mm.
years, went to federal prison for 13 years, and he's been out for like 5, and he's now writing books and doing podcasts and
Huh.
interviews and such. So he turned his life around. But at one point he mentions in his story that and not on my show, he's been on many shows, but he did mention at one point in one of his interviews that he was on the phone with an FBI agent, right? I forget how he got her number. I think like at one point he just might have had it, or he might have had the field office number, but he was at a gas station and he buys a burner phone and he calls her, and he's not taunting her, right? I know that's what I'm gonna make it sound like, but he's basically having this negotiation where he's like, okay, well, look, I can I'll turn myself in as long as I only get X amount of years, right? And her problem was basically that she could only affect that to a certain degree,
Yeah.
but she could only affect it within the jurisdiction of the FBI. And what I believe she said was that basically she couldn't she only had power over what the FBI could do because it was her field office that was investigating him. But at one point he comes to this realization and he's like, wait, are you pinging, like, are you tracking my location? And then she's like, oh, don't think you're that special. Like, don't have that big of an ego about yourself. And they were, and he found out later because apparently they sent 2 U.S. Marshals later to the exact location of the gas station that he bought the phone at. But what I thought about in our conversation is, and he describes this lady as very arrogant, and he describes himself as very arrogant, and he even says that when two arrogant people have an interaction, it's very problematic because it becomes this hyper competitive power dynamic where one wants power over the other and neither can get what they want at the end. So for her to say, so for her to say, don't think you're that special, I don't, or something along those lines, to track you down, don't think you're that special. On one hand, it puts his guard down because it's like, why would she say that, right? But on the other hand, it's like a double reverse psychology to where if I put his guard down enough to where I weaken his ego to where he thinks that I'm not going to track him down, and then I do track him down, he's not going to go on the run. He's not going to throw away the cell phone, which he ended up doing. He was smart enough to realize that it was a trap. But what are your thoughts on that type of negotiation?
So the reality of the situation, obviously not knowing his full story, if he is actually one of the highest level fugitives the FBI and the Secret Service are tracking, her response, I don't fully understand because it seems logical that you would, right? If you called an FBI agent and you're a fugitive on the run, I don't care if you're the biggest the FBI is looking for or not. If I know you're on the run, I'm texting all my people to say he's on the phone with me right now, right? And they are going to pursue that. And so I think it does sound like it kind of became more of this ego versus ego. And I always go back to what's your goal in any conversation. If your goal is to sound cool and look cool or feel tough, I hope she did in the moment, right? But it didn't necessarily accomplish something. Maybe she didn't want to say yes and they're 5 minutes away. I understand that you don't want to say it that way either. But maybe you figure out some other story by saying, no, you called me right now. I'm actually on the phone with you. I have not had a chance. But I sometimes I think the most honest answer is the right answer. And if she had said something like, yeah, I would love to track you. I just have not had a moment between talking to you and doing this, but yes, we're looking for you, right? Because I think in any negotiations or in that, they are smart enough to know, yes, we are looking for you and we're going to try to track you down. In a negotiation, when someone says, am I going to go to jail? I have to answer that question honestly. And if I try to BS you, you're going to know it and I lose credibility. And so you have to figure out the savvy way to say, maybe I minimize certain parts, but you have to say, yeah, George, you're smart enough. We can't not have any consequences from this action. You're too smart for me to tell you that, because you won't believe me. So here, let me talk it through with you what it is. And I think you build up your trust and credibility with that person by the honesty. And so, like I said, in my interaction with my husband, where I'm trying to have an argument and I want to stick it to them, you have to understand that's how that plays out in that interaction. Now, ultimately, was this guy caught? Yes. And he went to jail. So if you're picking a winner, did she probably win in the long run of that? Okay. But there's so many ways you could have done that without it being, because that's obviously stood out to him as arrogant or whatever. And so I just don't want to be that person in any interaction, really. So.
Well, the two ways that I would go about a situation like that, if I was, because again, you also got to remember that's a very panicky situation. Is that a very, very wanted fugitive of most wanted for the Secret Service? I think the FBI too, like most wanted for both of them. And he just calls you
Oh,
right? He
the
calls
surprise.
your field office. That's like it's gonna take a minute for you to like get
Yeah.
your thoughts together.
Yeah.
Because why would he, you got to ask like the why of like, why is this person trying to talk to me? But if I know he has a big ego, you could play into that and say, like you said, look, you're smart enough to know that I'm going to track you down from this number, right? Like you're not stupid. But then on the other hand, from her perspective of saying, look, dude, you're not that special, right?
Yeah.
Because having the title of the most wanted fugitive, in a way, it's cool. In a weird way, it's not something I
Yeah.
would want to do, but
I
it's
understand.
it's in a weird way having the most of anything and
Yeah.
being talked to like you're important and like you're powerful.
They
It's
love
a
it.
very intoxicating feeling for a lot of people. So with someone like him who is already kind of an ego maniac, and he himself says that, or at least at the time he was, who has this very arrogant personality. He was a con man. He like
Yeah.
those people are very charming, very, conniving and very arrogant. So for her to say, you're not that special, like get over yourself. Because I think that's where her exact words, now I'm thinking about it, it's get over yourself, like
Hmm.
not that special. He might have genuinely believed that for a second of like, wow, like for her to say that they're basically not looking for him, like not that they're not looking for him, but that they're not going to be putting all this effort into this phone number, immediate effort.
Yeah.
It's a double reverse of,
Maybe.
well, on one hand, she's probably right, but then therefore he's going to let his guard down, therefore he's not going to run, and therefore they have the time to track him. That could have been, I feel like that probably was why.
Or like you said, maybe not that he thought, oh, well, I guess they're not really tracking me, but maybe she concluded from all she knew about him, right? I don't know what all built up to that, but maybe she concluded that that would be something that would get to him and maybe cause him to make a mistake, to get like flustered or angry, and that that would help. Or in her assessment of him, that would make him stay on the phone longer or something like that. If that's what went into her mind, then okay, then maybe I do understand that, right? Maybe she decided that that was the best thing to say to kind of get to him, to cause a reaction. Um, and like I said, maybe if I don't know if he was found right from that phone call, but so maybe it did work.
Well, he was not found from the phone call.
Okay.
So when they sent the two U.S. Marshals to the gas station that he bought the phone at, they found nothing. I think he threw the phone away immediately after the phone call too, which is what I would do. But he throws it away, and he only bought the phone, I think, just to call her. And so there would be like no registration. He could just call,
Hmm.
and then they would just see the gas station.
Right.
Which what are they really going to get from that? So
Although it's funny, I mean, you could
yeah,
just make the argument of he probably feels a certain way about himself and it's cool to taunt and play this game with them.
yeah,
Okay. But you're also the one that's on the run. You live your whole life worrying if you're going to get caught today, tomorrow, the next day.
yeah,
As FBI agents, I might like this interaction. It may be exciting, but I'm on the side of good and light, right? So I get to go home and I sleep at night fine. I get paid to get up and chase you again, right? But it's different for you to live your life as the chased person. And so you
right.
may feel righteous and arrogant about who you are, but that's not a life I would choose to live at all either.
Yeah. Well, I
And
do
now
want to put, yeah,
he's come to the point that he's turned his life around anyway, right? So you
right.
that isn't really the life you want to live, even though it may sound exciting, but it's
Yeah.
really not. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, he was not taunting them. He'll even say, because what he said was that in the
Yeah. Why did
court.
he?
Well, he called, I think, because okay, I'm gonna be very honest with you. He talks for either very short amounts of time or tremendous amounts of time. So, or rather, I should say that he has the capability to talk for tremendous amounts of time. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I connected with him on that point. I'm like, look, dude, people tell me I talk a lot, right? And I'm like, I talk a lot because I try to explain everything in full detail and in full context, sometimes to a point where it's not necessary. And I think we just spoke about that. But when I didn't ask him about that part, but he did say though that when it comes to his talking, he'll talk for like he has like a 2 minute story, a version of a story, a 30-minute version of a story, and then a 6 hour version. And
Wow.
when he went on Lex Friedman, I think his total was like 7 hours 30 minutes. But he had to cut it down to 6 hours. But anyways, when it comes to why he was calling and what I learned from his interview with Lex was because I think what he was trying to gain from the interaction was um not taunting, but he was trying to basically turn himself in or figure out if he could and if that would benefit him in some way. Because what I think the ultimatum was with the FBI field office is that she wanted him to turn himself into there, but she didn't want to admit the fact that the Secret Service also had built a case against him, and
Yeah.
there's nothing she could do about that. But he kept on like confronting her on that and being like, what's the deal with the Secret Service, or like what's the deal with the other field offices or that are investigating you? And she kind of ignored the question or would dodge it, and then she finally came and said like, look, we can only give you 7 years with our field office, like if you turn yourself in here, what she's like. And then and she's like, if you turn yourself in now, and he's like, no, I want something in writing. Like, I don't want to like make this over the.
Yeah.
So he was in a defensive position, which is the worst thing to be in when you're in a negotiation.
Yeah. But like you said before, right, is understanding what does the person need, right? You're hearing what he's saying and he wants assurances from you. I recognize she's right. You can only speak so much. You're not the prosecutor. You're not the judge, right? So I can only make so many assurances. But could the big FBI and the big Secret Service come together and make an agreement together against this one person for all their cases? Yeah, you probably could work through that. It's not going to be quick. And, there's always a human interaction of who wants the credit and all that, right? But you could work that out. It wouldn't have been done in that phone call by just that agent, I'm sure. But maybe she could have understood that that was the need he was looking for to resolve it. And then said, let's do this. Call me back on Tuesday at 10:15. I'm going to have some of these conversations. I'll let you know the status, and then start working it through with those agencies talking to a prosecutor's office, because that may have helped resolve it. I'd be curious to know how it eventually got that he surrendered, turned himself in. But those things could happen if she understood what was behind the question. Because I think you said the conversation started of, can you give me assurances that if I turn myself in to you, that I only get 5 years or 10, whatever the conversation was. So,
yeah, well, it's definitely a complicated thing when you're dealing with a fugitive that's calling you, because I think that's the first time. Because his case is so interesting because it's so long. Number one, like there's just so many stories he has from it, and he was so good at being a con man. This is why like he was probably so wanted. He stole $55 million, I think it was estimated. So he was good at what he did, even though it was a bad thing. He was very good at it. He knew exactly how to do it, and he did it over and over again. But it didn't pay off in the end. So it's
never does. Yeah.
If ever. But yeah, no, he's an interesting guy for sure. But with his case though of negotiating things, like he knew exactly how it all worked. He saw it firsthand.
Wow.
He actually broke probation. Like at one point, I think he made like multiple fake lives. Even like he would make an entire social security number, license plate, or license and everything, and he would get court dates like under fake identities. Like that's how real they were, and he was good at it. He was great at it. But
everybody has a skill. I would hope that you would use that skill for good. And hey, maybe, who knows, on the trajectory of his life, it started out that way, but maybe that's what turned his life around and he's now using that for good. Okay, I'll take that.
Yeah, well, now he's like writing people's stories, doing interviews like on my show. He has his own podcast. But yeah, I'm happy for him.
Yeah, very cool.
But
people are fascinating. Their lives are fascinating, how they live in the world. I'm very.
One case I actually wanted to talk about was I had this guy on the other day. His name is Jack Reisider. He owns this podcast called Darknet Diaries, where he literally he will interview wanted hackers. Like he interviews like hackers, hackers that have been caught, hackers that have not been caught. That's a big one. People that have like leaked all this data and information, stuff like that. And one of the things that he said was really interesting is that I asked him, I'm like, has law enforcement ever reached out to you? Because I was curious, because I'm like, you talk to so many criminals every day that are wanted by the FBI and all these agencies. So I asked him, I'm like, do you feel like you've ever been spied on or like investigated or looked into? And have you ever been contacted by the FBI? And he said, actually, yes, that he had been contacted by the FBI, but not in the way you think. And I'm like,
Hmm.
what do you mean, not in the way you think? And he's like, well, not in the sense of like knocking on my door, like, hey, we want to have a word with you. But they would literally message him on social media, and I don't know how, but they would message him on social media and they would just say, hey, we know you're contacting this person and we want to know more about how he does X. We don't necessarily want to catch him, but we want to know more about how he does X or Y. So
Like,
we
could you
will.
help with that? Meaning they were like, could you ask this question to find that out for us?
Well, no. What they would do is they would tell him, "Can we have contact with this person? Can you reach out to him for us?"
Hmm.
And he would say to the guy, "Look, they want to have a word with you about how you're doing X, Y, and Z. Um, you don't have to." And he's like, he'll even recommend to them. He'll be like, "Make a burner account. Make
Hmm.
sure it's not your information, whatever." And they're smart enough to know
They would
that.
say that. Yeah.
Yeah, so he'll be like, they just want to know how you do this. And if they're open to doing it, he'll send the FBI the information and
Hmm.
there'll be a dialogue. Um, what do you think of that type of negotiation?
I love the approach. I love the approach is, people have ideas about how the FBI is, right? And so, yeah, knocking on the door, like, we have to have a word with you. Again, does the aggressive positioning help you? No, a lot of times the partnering with people is the better, more successful position, right? So by coming saying, hey, we see that you do a certain thing. We're interested in this. Is there a way we could work together? I love that approach. I would love to know more that if he was able to connect them with people, if that end up working out, that someone was ready to talk to him, that'd be fascinating to know. But I think you have to be creative in changing the way that you approach people, and understanding that it's not always best to come full power in your face, down your throat, because it just puts people off, right? And so I credit those agents or whoever it was that was smart enough to see this podcaster doing this, having an interest, and then figuring out, like, how can I reach out to them and how can I bring them on board to help our investigations, right? Because you have to learn to appeal to that podcaster by saying, we would love to get things and could you help us? But the podcaster may not want to do that because it cuts against what he or she is trying to do. So I give them a lot of credit for trying it.
Yeah, and it ended up working because he set up multiple of these
Good.
interactions with hackers that are, I don't know if they're necessarily wanted. Some of them are just people that hack and their names aren't necessarily publicly available.
Yeah.
So then the FBI, doesn't have a criminal case against them. So it's not like they're going to subpoena Twitter and say like, hey, we need this information. So they'll just ask him. And even if they did subpoena them, chances are it's probably fake information too. So it doesn't really benefit them in the end. So it is a very smart thing, in my opinion. And I'm glad that you agree.
Yeah, I do.
Um, uh, One thing he did say though, and I want to bring this up earlier too, is he said that he's actually been contacted by the Eastern, like not Eastern, he's been contacted by prosecutors, like federal prosecutors that would message him on social media, and they would say after he would do an interview, I guess the prosecutor would watch an interview that he did with that person, and they'd be like, dude, how did you get him to admit to literally everything?
Hmm.
And he'd be like, what do you mean? And then the prosecutor would say to the interviewer, Jack, like, well, when we were interrogating him, he was so reluctant. He wouldn't say a word. He was so stubborn, and he was ended up being guilty anyways. But then Jack said to me something that we've been talking about this whole time, which is he's like, well, you guys are kind of the enemies to him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like, why should he tell you anything, especially when he knows that it's going to be incriminating evidence?
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, who you are, who they think you are in this negotiation will dictate what you do and don't get, right? So sometimes there's only so much you can do by presenting in a way that makes that person comfortable. Are you ever fully comfortable when you're a target and I'm an FBI agent or a federal prosecutor? No, right? But people will share things with you. I'm amazed every time. I think there is no way you're going to tell me that. And they do tell you. I've had people tell me things that no one else would know, and there's no way it could ever be proven. But because the way that you get them comfortable, they share stuff with you. Sometimes it's human nature wanting to get that off of them, of their conscience or whatever. And so that's why they share things with you. But I do think it's different if you're a podcaster. I can feel differently in this interaction with you because I get to brag or sound cool and know all these things on your podcast. I imagine that would later be used against you in court if we could prove that was you on the podcast, right? And so you're going to feel differently when you talk to a federal prosecutor saying certain things than when you say it to a podcaster. So the thing I think that the FBI does, and that anybody should do in any interaction, right, is to be sophisticated in how you approach people to learn things, right? So the FBI uses sources to gather information because things will be said differently to sources than to FBI agents, right? Your interaction and interrogation is different. Doing spy stuff is all different because you have to be smart in how you approach those things if you're trying to gather information. Sometimes it's better to go through a third party, that you can be more successful than just going directly from me. So you have to just weigh those things, I think, depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. But to be fair, I think the guy was the court case had already been finished, and she was just contacting him, saying, how did you do that? That's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean that's an interesting case though, because I know actually, and he admitted this to me on my interview. I'm like, because I was so curious. I'm like, do the FBI do people spy on you? Do people reach out to you? How does this work? And he's like, well, the FBI, I think he said the NSA definitely watches his show because, it's mainly about hacking and technology. And, he's even had NSA agents that are currently working there on. And funny enough, that actually went through the director's, Paul Nakasone, his desk. So that was pretty cool. But what you told me about.
Yeah, because approval to go on.
Yeah.
But you want to get your message out too, right? And so you have to just understand what is the message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now the last two questions. One is something we spoke about over the phone. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. But it's the wedding setup.
Oh,
so the undercover case. That was very interesting. And I should have mentioned this earlier. And I think it's a good closing, other than the last question I'm going to ask you. But just tell me about it. Just tell the audience.
So this was an undercover case that I was involved in. And I became involved in a later stage and brought in to really just be a supporting role. And there was a male undercover that was involved prior, had been for years, was working his way up through the organization, meeting higher and higher level people. And I was brought in really just to help him not be put in a compromising, uncomfortable position, right? So the FBI and working undercover, it's smart. If you present yourself a certain way, you can have other people around you that are also undercovers that help support your legend and your story, right? So that's originally how I got brought in. And we traveled overseas and we were in another country and we had worked through this significant arms deal that was going to happen. And this was a major thing at the time for the FBI, for the US, in our national security and interactions with other not friendly countries. And while talking about it, we were saying, gosh, now we have targets all over, not only the US, but now the world. And how do you get all these people back in and arrest them? And so, half as a joke, I said that you should have Lou and I, that was my partner, you should say that we're going to get married. And then we can plan a wedding and invite the targets to the wedding. Now, part of that also tells people, the targets, hey, you are a valued member of this organization and to be invited to the wedding of this person, right? It invites them into a bit of the personal life of someone by allowing them to meet your significant other, to attend the wedding. So it plays into all of those things, which is part of our strategy to make them feel comfortable and connected. And when you feel comfortable and connected, you share things, sometimes crimes, and that helps us gather evidence. And so we then said that we were going to get married. And over the next year of our interactions with these targets, we were telling them about this wedding that we were planning. And then we invited them to our wedding in the end. And that is how the case was taken down, is they all came in. We did a bachelorette party. We did a rehearsal dinner. They brought us presents. And we sent limousines to go pick them up to drive them to our wedding, our alleged wedding. And then before they could get driven to the wedding is when we had FBI agents come and arrest them. So they were in suits carrying wedding presents. They brought dates, some of them. And so it was just a way for us to build up over time the way to take this case down, because there were so many people. We had to be smart. Like, how are we going to get them all in one place at the time? There were some people that weren't at the level that would get invited to the wedding, right? And so they were just part of an FBI takedown where you would get them either at their work or at their homes. But the main players that got arrested were the higher level targets, and they got arrested at the wedding.
Yeah, well, you did do a lot of undercover work, which I will say is it's funny because it's very related to hostage negotiation. It's building a relationship with someone that, to some extent, isn't necessarily real, right? It's not as deep, maybe the conversation we're having now, or the conversation that you would have with someone that and really like personally. Now, there is some element of that you do have to build a legitimate understanding, but at the end of the day, you also have to realize that you're going to have to figure out a method to apprehend the person. Yeah. So it's a very different relationship than if you're talking to a friend, where hopefully your goal is not to apprehend them at the end of it. So now the last two questions, I guess, would be, do you have any advice for young people? Or maybe I already asked that.
You didn't. No, you asked me if I had any regrets about my career. I do not. I guess advice for young people is, I don't know if it's young people interested in FBI or not, but just make choices. Like I said, for me, it was like, just say yes to the next thing, because you just never know where your life's going to go. I never thought I would be an FBI agent ever. I was a nervous, shyer kid. And the fact that I went into the FBI is funny to me. The fact that I worked undercover and as a hostage negotiator is even funnier to me and my family. But you just never know where your life's going to go. So challenge yourself a little bit, step out of your comfort zone, because you'd be amazed what comes of that and what you can get yourself into. Because I never imagined I would have the career that I had. And now that I'm older and looking back and I'm not a young person, I think, oh, I'm so glad I did all of those things, because I learned so much about myself. It changed me as a person. And just even on a smaller scale, it just gives me good stories to have. So don't be afraid to, work a little bit harder. You shouldn't have to work all the time and stress yourself out, but don't be afraid to take on something that seems big and major, because you'll always figure a way to make it happen. And then you'll learn and grow from that.
Now, the last question is, do you have any advice for the audience in general?
That would be it's kind of what we've talked about throughout this whole time, is model the behavior that you want to see. So if you hate in an interaction with people that it's angry or competitive or partisan, whatever it is, if you don't like that, then don't be that, right? So start every interaction trying to understand the other side, trying to display this empathy, because I think that grows and that's contagious. We all have the negative side to us, like our angels and our devils, right? Don't feed into competitive and angry, and because I just think those types of things can get amplified, right? So be more intentional in your interaction with people. And it's not always just your agenda that you're pushing, right? Consider the other person, because I think then they feel a certain way after that interaction with you, and then hopefully they go do that to someone else, and that grows. I feel like the way our world is right now, it's very tense and aggressive, and we're seeing it on the world stage. I bomb you, you bomb me, I bomb you. Like, why does it end, right? Somebody has to do a different interaction to have that interaction change. And so why not be that person? That would what I would love to be my parting words.
All right. Sounds good. I'm going to stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit after the show. I do have to go soon, but
okay.
All right. So, yep.
Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too. All right. In
Yeah.
3, 2, 1.